The night was quiet, and the streets were mostly empty. 17-year-old Maya Carter walked home after finishing her evening shift at the small bookstore where she worked. She loved books, and even though the job didn't pay much, she enjoyed spending time around stories and learning new things. Maya adjusted her backpack and hummed softly to herself. Her beautiful, long black curls bounced as she walked. She had tied them up earlier, but a few strands had come loose. The soft wind made them dance around her face. As she turned onto a quiet street, the sound of a police siren made her stop. Blue and red lights flashed behind her. She turned around and saw a police car pulling up beside her. The window rolled down, and a female officer looked at her with sharp, narrowed eyes. "Hey, you, stop right there," the officer ordered. Maya froze, confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her heart started to beat a little faster, but she took a deep breath. She had seen videos of people getting into trouble just because they argued with the police. She decided to stay calm. "Yes, officer," she asked politely. The officer, whose name tag read Karen Whitmore, stepped out of the car and walked toward her. She looked Maya up and down as if trying to find something wrong. "You matched the description of a suspect," Karen said, crossing her arms. Maya frowned. "A suspect? I just got off work. I haven't done anything." Karen's eyes flickered to Maya's hair. "Where are you coming from?" "The bookstore," Maya answered, pointing back toward the street she had just come from. "I work there." Karen didn't seem to care about Maya's answer. Instead, she grabbed her radio and muttered something into it. Then, she turned back to Maya. "Let me see some ID." Maya quickly reached into her backpack and pulled out her wallet. Her hands shook slightly as she handed over her ID. Karen looked at it for a long moment, then smirked. "You still look suspicious," she said. Maya's stomach twisted. She had heard stories about people getting stopped for no reason, but she never thought it would happen to her. She was just trying to go home. "I told you, I just got off work," Maya repeated, her voice quieter now. "You can call my boss." Karen shook her head. "No need. You're coming with me." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "What? Why?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed Maya's wrist and pulled her toward the police car. "Wait, I didn't do anything," Maya protested, trying to stay calm, but panic was rising inside her. "Stop resisting," Karen snapped, tightening her grip. Maya's heart pounded. She wasn't resisting. She was just scared. The bookstore was only a few streets away. If someone saw her, maybe they could help. But the street was empty, and no one was there to witness what was happening. As Karen pushed Maya into the back of the police car, tears stung her eyes. She had never felt so powerless before. She didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything. The police car moved through the empty streets, and Maya sat in the back, her hands trembling. She had never been in trouble before. Her parents always taught her to be respectful and follow the rules. But now, she was trapped, and she didn't even know why. Officer Karen didn't say much as she drove. She only glanced at Maya through the rearview mirror now and then, her expression unreadable. Maya wanted to ask again why she was being taken in, but her throat felt dry. After what felt like forever, the car pulled up in front of the police station. The large building looked cold and unwelcoming under the bright streetlights. Maya swallowed hard as Karen stepped out and opened the door for her. "Out," Karen said firmly. Maya hesitated for a second, but she didn't want to cause more trouble. She stepped out, her legs feeling weak beneath her. As they entered the station, a few officers looked up. Some of them gave curious glances, but no one said anything. Karen led Maya down a hallway and into a small room. It was empty except for a chair and a desk. "Sit," Karen ordered. Maya sat down, gripping the sides of her chair. "Can I please call my parents?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen ignored her. Instead, she walked over to a cabinet, pulled something out, and turned back around. In her hand was a pair of scissors. Maya's heart stopped. What? What are you doing? Karen tapped the scissors against her hand and sighed. It's procedure, she said. Your hair needs to be cut. Maya's eyes widened in shock. What? That's not true. There's no rule like that. Karen smirked. Oh, really? Are you the officer here? Please, don't do this, Maya begged, her voice shaking. Her hair was a part of her. She had taken care of it for years. It wasn't just hair. It was a part of her identity. But Karen wasn't listening. She stepped closer, lifting the scissors. Maya flinched, pressing herself against the chair. Another officer walked by the room and paused at the door. He looked uncomfortable. Karen, are you sure about this? Mind your business, Karen snapped. It's the rules. The officer hesitated, then looked at Maya. His eyes were filled with sympathy, but he turned and walked away. Maya squeezed her eyes shut as the cold metal of the scissors touched her curls. She felt the sharp blades cut through her hair, and the soft strands fell to the floor. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she refused to cry out loud. She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction. When it was over, Karen stepped back, admiring her work. Much better, she said with a smirk. Maya stared at the floor, feeling numb. She had never felt so powerless in her life. But what Karen didn't know was that she had just made a terrible mistake, one that would change everything. Maya sat completely still, staring at the strands of her hair scattered on the cold floor. It didn't feel real. Just minutes ago, her curls had been tied up neatly, and now they were gone. Taken from her without reason. Her fingers itched to reach up and touch her head, but she was too afraid to move. Karen tossed the scissors onto the desk and crossed her arms. Now that wasn't so bad, was it? She said with a smirk. Maya didn't answer. She felt hollow, like something inside her had been broken. Karen turned to another officer standing near the door. Put her in holding for the night. She can wait until we figure out what to do with her in the morning. Maya's head snapped up. Wait, please, I need to call my parents. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Karen rolled her eyes. You'll get your call when we decide you've earned it. She waved her hand dismissively, signaling the other officer to take her away. The officer hesitated for a brief moment before gently grabbing Maya's arm. He wasn't rough like Karen, but his grip was firm. He led her down a hallway toward the holding cells. The further they walked, the colder the air seemed to get. When they reached the last cell, he unlocked the heavy metal door and gestured for her to step inside. Maya looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. The officer sighed, but didn't say anything. Instead, he closed the door behind her with a loud clang. Maya turned and faced the small, empty cell. The walls were dull and gray. The bench against the wall was hard, and there was a single flickering light above her. She took a shaky breath and sat down, hugging her arms around herself. For the first time since this nightmare began, she let the tears fall freely. She thought about her father and mother, probably wondering why she hadn't come home yet. They must have been worried. If only she had been allowed to call them, this would all be over. Time passed slowly. The station was quiet except for the occasional footsteps of officers walking by. Maya had no idea what time it was, but she felt exhausted. Her body ached from sitting in the hard chair earlier, and her head throbbed from stress. Eventually, she closed her eyes and leaned against the wall. She told herself to stay strong, but the weight of what had happened made her feel small and powerless. Just when she started to drift into an uneasy sleep, she heard two officers whispering outside her cell. Does she even belong here? One of them murmured. It doesn't feel right. The other responded. Maya barely had the energy to react. She already knew this wasn't right. The real question was, when would someone finally do something about it? Maya's hands were shaking as she held the cold metal bars of her cell. She had lost track of time. Was it early morning yet? Had her parents figured out she was missing? The room was silent except for the occasional sound of officers talking in the distance. Her head still felt strange without her hair. She hadn't dared to touch it, afraid that the feeling of it being gone would make everything worse. But deep down, she knew that something had to change. This couldn't be the end. Finally, after what felt like hours, an officer approached her cell. He was younger than the others and didn't look at her with the same harshness that Karen did. Instead, his face showed hesitation, almost like he knew something wasn't right. "You can make your call now," he said, unlocking the cell door. Maya jumped to her feet. "Really?" The officer nodded and led her down the hall. Maya's heart pounded as she followed. This was her only chance. She had to call her father. He would know what to do. The officer handed her an old black phone and stepped back, giving her a moment. With shaky fingers, she dialed her father's number. It rang once, twice. Then she heard his deep, familiar voice. "Maya." His tone was sharp with worry. "Where are you?" Tears filled her eyes. "Dad, I'm at the police station," she whispered. "They arrested me for no reason. And they cut my hair." There was silence on the other end. For a moment, Maya thought the call had dropped. Then her father spoke again, but his voice was different now. Calm, steady, and serious. "Stay where you are. I'm coming," he said. The call ended, and Maya slowly put the phone down. Something about her father's voice gave her a sense of relief, but also a strange feeling in her chest. She had never heard him sound like that before. The officer took her back to her cell, but this time, Maya didn't feel as hopeless. She sat on the bench, staring at the floor, waiting. Less than an hour later, a commotion started at the front of the station. Loud voices filled the air, and the sound of someone demanding answers made several officers turn their heads. Then, a deep, commanding voice echoed through the halls. "Where is my daughter?" Maya's heart leaped. She jumped to her feet and grabbed the bars, trying to see outside. Footsteps approached quickly, and then she saw him, her father, Judge Marcus Carter, standing in the doorway. His sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on her. His expression was calm, but there was something in his gaze that made every officer around him step back. Karen, standing nearby, suddenly looked nervous. Maya had no idea what was about to happen, but for the first time that night, she felt hope. The room fell silent as Judge Marcus Carter stepped forward. His tall figure, dressed in a crisp dark suit, commanded attention. His expression was calm, but his sharp eyes scanned the room with a quiet intensity that made everyone uneasy. Karen Whitmore, who had been so confident before, shifted uncomfortably. She cleared her throat and forced a small smirk. "And you are?" she asked, folding her arms. Judge Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the officer standing near Maya's cell. "Open the door. Now." The officer hesitated, glancing at Karen. She gave him a sharp look, silently warning him not to move. But the officer's hands were already shaking. He knew who this man was. Karen let out a small chuckle. "I don't know who you think you are, but your daughter was brought in for a reason. She was being uncooperative, and we followed standard procedures." Judge Carter turned his eyes to her, and for the first time, Karen felt something she wasn't used to. Uncertainty. "Standard procedures." His voice was dangerously calm. "You detained my daughter without reason, denied her a phone call until now. And then," he took a slow step forward, "you shaved her hair. Tell me, Officer Whitmore, which procedure is that?" Karen opened her mouth but said nothing. "I'll tell you what this is," Judge Carter continued, his voice steady but filled with authority. "This is a violation of her rights. This is unlawful treatment. And this," he gestured toward Maya's holding cell, "is the last mistake you'll ever make in your career." Karen's face twitched, but she forced a fake smile. "Look, I was just following." "Enough." Judge Carter's voice was sharp now, cutting through the room like a blade. "I want my daughter released immediately. and I want every second of security footage from the moment she arrived here." He turned to the officer holding the keys. "I won't ask again. Open that door." The officer, now visibly sweating, fumbled with the keys and quickly unlocked the cell. The heavy door creaked open, and Maya rushed forward into her father's arms. He held her gently, his large hands resting on her shoulders as he looked down at her with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. Maya shook her head, tears slipping down her face. "No, but," she swallowed hard, "they took my hair." A shadow passed over Judge Carter's face. His jaw tightened, but he kept his emotions in check. He turned back to Karen. "You will regret this," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that made Karen's fake confidence disappear completely. The station was dead silent. Every officer stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen tried to recover. "Sir, there's no need to." Judge Carter pulled out his phone. "I'll be making a few calls, and by the time I'm done, you'll wish you had followed real procedures." For the first time, Karen looked truly afraid. The atmosphere in the police station had completely changed. Officers who had been watching silently now stood stiffly, avoiding Judge Carter's gaze. Even the ones who had doubted Karen's actions earlier now seemed nervous. Karen Whitmore, however, still tried to act confident. She forced a small smirk and crossed her arms. "Look, Judge Carter, I don't know what you think you're doing, but your daughter was acting suspiciously. I was just doing my job." Judge Carter didn't react to her words. Instead, he dialed a number on his phone. Maya stood beside him, gripping his arm tightly. Even though she was still shaken, she felt safer now. A moment later, the call connected. "Yes, this is Judge Marcus Carter. I need the police commissioner on the line. Now." Karen's smirk finally faded. There was a heavy silence as Judge Carter waited, his expression unreadable. When the commissioner finally answered, his deep voice filled the quiet room. "Judge Carter, what's the matter?" "I'm standing in the local station where my daughter has been unlawfully detained, mistreated, and humiliated by one of your officers," Judge Carter said, his voice controlled but filled with power. "I want immediate action taken." Karen's face paled. "Sir, this is unnecessary." Judge Carter lifted a hand, cutting her off without even looking at her. On the phone, the commissioner sounded alarmed. "Your daughter? Which officer was responsible?" Judge Carter glanced at Karen for the briefest second. "Officer Whitmore," he said simply. Karen's breath hitched. The commissioner didn't even hesitate. "That's unacceptable. I will personally see to it that this is handled. Judge Carter, I assure you, this will not be ignored." Judge Carter's lips pressed into a firm line. "Good, because I will be filing a formal complaint and taking legal action. I also expect my daughter's record to be cleared of any false charges immediately." "Consider it done," the commissioner said quickly. Judge Carter ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He turned to Maya, gently placing a hand on her back. "Let's go home." Maya nodded, relief washing over her. As they turned to leave, Karen finally found her voice again. "Wait, you can't just." Judge Carter gave her one last look, his eyes sharp and full of quiet authority. "Officer Whitmore, you abused your power, and now you'll face the consequences." Karen swallowed hard, unable to respond. Judge Carter didn't waste another second. He led Maya out of the station, his presence still heavy in the air, even after he was gone. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Maya took a deep breath. The weight on her chest began to lift. She still felt shaken, still felt hurt, but she also felt something else. Justice was coming, and Karen Whitmore had no idea what was about to hit her. The ride home was silent. Maya sat in the passenger seat of her father's car, staring out of the window. The streetlights passed by in a blur, but she barely noticed them. Her fingers touched the short strands of her hair, and a lump formed in her throat. Judge Carter kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He hadn't spoken much since they left the police station, but Maya could feel the anger radiating from him. Not the kind of anger that led to shouting, but the kind that meant serious consequences were coming. Finally, he spoke. "Maya," he said softly, "I am so sorry this happened to you." Maya turned to him, her eyes burning with unused tears. "I just don't understand, Dad. I did nothing wrong. I was just walking home." Judge Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, and I promise you, those responsible won't get away with it." Maya swallowed hard. "But will anything really change?" she asked in a small voice. "People like her, Officer Whitmore, they always seem to get away with things like this." Judge Carter glanced at her, his expression firm. "Not this time," he said. "I've already spoken to the commissioner, but that's only the beginning. There will be a full investigation, and I will make sure this reaches the right people." Maya looked down at her hands. She wanted to believe him. Her father was a respected judge, and she knew he had power, but she had seen too much unfairness in the world to trust that justice would always be served. When they arrived home, her mother was waiting at the door. The moment Maya stepped out of the car, her mother ran to her and pulled her into a tight hug. "My baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her mother's embrace. For the first time that night, she let out a soft sob. Her mother pulled back and cupped Maya's face gently. When she saw Maya's hair, her eyes filled with pain. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. Judge Carter answered for her. "It was an officer abusing her power, but we will make sure she faces the consequences." Maya's mother took a deep breath, her expression shifting from sorrow to quiet determination. "Then we fight," she said firmly. "Not just for Maya, but for every person who has ever been treated unfairly." Judge Carter nodded. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Maya wiped her tears, a small spark of hope flickering inside her. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this. The next morning, news of the incident had already started spreading. Social media posts about Officer Whitmore's actions were gaining attention. Reporters were asking questions. People wanted answers. And soon, the world would know the truth. The ride home was silent. Maya sat in the passenger seat of her father's car, staring out of the window. The streetlights passed by in a blur, but she barely noticed them. Her fingers touched the short strands of her hair, and a lump formed in her throat. Judge Carter kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He hadn't spoken much since they left the police station, but Maya could feel the anger radiating from him. Not the kind of anger that led to shouting, but the kind that meant serious consequences were coming. Finally, he spoke. "Maya," he said softly, "I am so sorry this happened to you." Maya turned to him, her eyes burning with unused tears. "I just don't understand, Dad. I did nothing wrong. I was just walking home." Judge Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, and I promise you, those responsible won't get away with it." Maya swallowed hard. "But will anything really change?" she asked in a small voice. "People like her, Officer Whitmore, they always seem to get away with things like this." Judge Carter glanced at her, his expression firm. "Not this time," he said. "I've already spoken to the commissioner, but that's only the beginning. There will be a full investigation, and I will make sure this reaches the right people." Maya looked down at her hands. She wanted to believe him. Her father was a respected judge, and she knew he had power, but she had seen too much unfairness in the world to trust that justice would always be served. When they arrived home, her mother was waiting at the door. The moment Maya stepped out of the car, her mother ran to her and pulled her into a tight hug. "My baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her mother's embrace. For the first time that night, she let out a soft sob. Her mother pulled back and cupped Maya's face gently. When she saw Maya's hair, her eyes filled with pain. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. Judge Carter answered for her. It was an officer abusing her power, but we will make sure she faces the consequences. Maya's mother took a deep breath, her expression shifting from sorrow to quiet determination. Then we fight, she said firmly. Not just for Maya, but for every person who has ever been treated unfairly. Judge Carter nodded. That's exactly what we're going to do. Maya wiped her tears, a small spark of hope flickering inside her. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this. The next morning, news of the incident had already started spreading. Social media posts about Officer Whitmore's actions were gaining attention. Reporters were asking questions. People wanted answers. And soon, the world would know the truth.